Hi, I'm Leanne Palmerston from Hamilton Family Doulas, and you are joining us for Birth and Baby Talk. This is our weekly live show where we talk about topics that are important to pregnant, birthing, and new parents. And this week we're talking about due dates. I don't know about you, but I find due dates so confusing, even after 16 years working as a birth doula, more than 17 years being a parent, having been pregnant almost 18 years ago. But so let's talk about them and take some of the mystery out because they're incredibly confusing. You think, okay, I missed my period, and if I count forward from, maybe when you might have had sex, or you definitely, maybe you've been tracking, especially these days with apps. A lot of us track our cycles, maybe even tracking your cycles, so you know exactly when your last period was, and then you count forward and you think, okay, I know exactly when my due date is. My baby comes 40 weeks after I get pregnant. And then, you go and you talk to your doctor and you say, I think I'm pregnant. And your doctor says, okay, well, here's your due date. And your due date is slightly different than what you thought it was. And you're like, no, you're like 3 days off. And they're like, no, I'm right. And then a few weeks later, maybe they send you for an ultrasound, what's often called an early dating ultrasound, which is often done, in the first 5 to 8 weeks of pregnancy. You go for an early dating ultrasound, and they tell you yet another date. And you think, wait a minute, I thought I was due on April 30th, and now I'm due on April 27th. But then the ultrasound determines that apparently I'm due on May 3rd. What's going on? So if this is confusing to you, that's because everybody is using different ways to calculate due dates. Some of them are more and less accurate than the others. So let's find out what that means. And also how to figure out your due date, but also what does that mean in terms of when exactly is your baby going to come? So let's look first at a good old classic, Nagela's Law. Now, Nagela's Law says that a person can expect their baby to be due approximately 40 days after, or 40 weeks, sorry, for approximately 40 weeks after the first day of their last menstrual cycle. So if anyone asks you, when was your last period, you need to know what the day of the start was. So it doesn't matter that your, last day of your cycle may have been November 15th. If your cycle started on November 11th, then that's the day we count as the first day of your last menstrual period. We call that LMP. So we've got the LMP. We need to know that. So Nagela's Law actually is really complicated. It says, take the first day of your last menstrual cycle, count forward by 7 days, and then count backwards by 3 months. And that's the day you're going to be due next year or in the future. We got to go backwards before we can project forwards. Well, an easier way of doing that is simply to count 280 days forward from the first day of your last menstrual cycle. So, I normally have one of those. If you've ever seen them at your midwife or doctor's office, they're like these little sort of nested spinners, these paper spinners. I love those. And for some reason, I can't find mine. Typical. I've got a stash of babies and boobs and uteruses over there, but I can't find a simple piece of cardboard. So let's go. I'm going to borrow from this really great website called Evidence-Based Birth to give you those dates. All right. how do we calculate it? We go, okay, and this really only applies for those of us who have a really, really sort of normal menstrual cycle that lasts 28 days long, and for whom those of us, we ovulate on the 14th day, right? So Nagela's law only applies to you if you have this super classic normal menstrual cycle. So if you got a 28-day cycle that you ovulate on day 14 every time, then this is going to be pretty accurate for you. So let's say if your last menstrual cycle was April 4th, you add 7 days, which brings you to April 11th, but then you subtract 3 months, which brings you back to January 11th, which means January 11th would be your due date. However, that is not super accurate because that is exactly like approximately 40 weeks about. Yeah, it's 40 weeks from the first day of your last period. But babies don't really come on time. They're not Amazon packages. So how the heck do you figure that out? Well, that's where the ultrasound comes in. So back in the 70s, like we'd been following Nagela's law for a really long time. Before Nagela's law, we just kind of, I don't know, what did we do? I think Nagela's law has been in place for a really long time, and I'm not sure what preceded it. I can find that out if anyone wants to know. And if anyone does know, tell me. I'm really excited to find that out. But I'm really focused on the information that's going to really help my clients right now. So we go from Nagela's law to then in the 70s, we realized if we take an ultrasound of babies before 20 weeks, generally all babies grow at the same expected rate. So all babies are kind of about the same size in those first 20 weeks of pregnancy. And after about 20 weeks, then different factors start to come into play that determines the size of the baby. So after 20 weeks, that's when maybe the maternal diet. So if you have a diet that is full of really good proteins, really good fruits and vegetables and things. So you've got absolutely the peak of nutritional needs that your body could have. Then you might have a baby who's maybe a little bit on the taller, broader side, right? Not necessarily, I'm not saying that if you eat really well that you're going to grow a giant monster baby, but you're going to grow a baby who is like optimally sized, right? Good, strong baby. If you're not eating a fully nutritious diet, and I don't mean that you get pizzas every weekend and you eat the odd occasional McDonald's hamburger. I don't care. It doesn't matter that you have a little bit extra coffee once in a while, or you skip a meal once in a while because you're very busy. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about someone maybe who lives with a lot of food insecurity and deep poverty. So if we go back, say, let's go historically, right? If we look at Victorian times, a Victorian lady who was pregnant was getting lots of good food, tons and tons of nutrition into her body. But say a washerwoman who lived on the street who didn't necessarily have a lot of money and probably had 8 kids to support that sucked up all her funds. Well, she was probably not eating well. She was probably eating porridge every single day of her life, bread. She was probably having very rare bits of meat, maybe not very much dairy. So that's what I'm talking about. If you're not getting some of those significant nutritional needs at all, then you're definitely going to have babies that are going to be smaller in size because the growing body won't have the nutritional pool of materials to draw from. Right. So we start to see differences that way. If there's any kind of problem with the baby's DNA and or the cord and its ability to pass blood and nutrition from the placenta into baby and back, if there's any problems with that, that's going to impact the way a baby grows. And in fact, when there's problems in the cord specifically or the placenta and not enough blood, which carries the oxygen and nutrition, is not flowing back and forth properly, then what we generally see is something called intrauterine growth restriction. And that's where a baby grows chronically undersized, and they tend to have a little more problems. We want them to be born a tiny bit earlier. Pardon me. That was like a weird inside burp. I'm sorry. They have these growth problems, and they generally are born a little tiny bit earlier with some help to make sure that they're growing properly, because it's easier to take care of them on the outside of your body than on the inside. So after 20 weeks, right, these kinds of factors come into play. If you have diabetes and your blood sugars are really playing up, then you may have too much blood sugar in your system chronically, like day in and day out. And babies who are grown in that kind of like soup of nutrients, those babies tend to be quite big, quite chunky babies who have an unlimited amount of, say, fuel to get them to a much larger size. So all of those factors start to come in after 20 weeks. Additionally, the DNA kicks in for how tall or strong your baby is going to be, right? So the babies of very, very tall people, very, very broad-shouldered, big-headed people, those babies start to outpace their peers who come from more petite parents. So those factors start to play in. But before that, we can look at a baby's leg bone, let's say their tibia, and we can say that all babies at this age have tibias that are exactly like this long and this thick across. And so those are the kinds of measurements that are taken at those early dating ultrasounds. And even at the 20-week ultrasound, especially if you didn't have an early dating ultrasound, you might have your dating sort of confirmed or adjusted at your midterm. I have like a hair stuck to me at your midterm exam. Ultrasound exam. So so you go in for an ultrasound exam and they have a look at, your baby's like leg bone, and they say, oh, no, you're not due on April 30th. You're due on May 3rd. And so even though it's a couple of days, they will adjust it. And that comes into play, like why those dates are important a little later. At first, it's just annoying. So raise your hand if you had your date changed. You spent months thinking you were due on one day and then had your date changed to something else. I did. And I knew exactly the date I conceived because we were paying attention to that kind of thing. So it's really funny when that can happen. But, oh well. What can I do? So one of the reasons why those numbers are so important to have, so, like even though I knew exactly the day I conceived, which means that according to Nagel's law, I should know exactly what my due date would be. It's important that when they changed my due date to a few days later, that kind of came into play when I did finally go into labor, and I went into labor a little early. So my babies tend to like to cook for about 3 weeks short of 40 weeks. Both of my children were born at approximately 37-ish weeks. One was a day before and the other was a few days later. But I guess that's my babies just want to get out and start partying. And I don't blame them. You know, I guess I got to skip that late pregnancy, annoying when the heck is this baby going to be born thing, because my babies came a little early. So, but the one baby came according to my my official due date. That baby was born. That baby was born at 36 and 6. So I went into labor at 36 days or 36 weeks and 6 days of gestation, right? Instead of 40. So that means that my baby was considered preterm. Now, term isn't just your due date. Term is from 37 weeks to 42 and 6 days, right? So 37 weeks and 0 days to 41 weeks and 6 days, which is 1 day short of 42 weeks. That is considered term. That's a 5-week stretch. And the vast majority of babies who are born within that 5 weeks. So here's the answer to the question, when will my baby be born? Your baby will be born somewhere within a 5-week month. So we can look at the due date as being a kind of a target, but a general target. And the due date, much like a target, right, is the center red circle. And then on the outside of the circle are the days and weeks that make up 5 weeks surrounding that date. And so it doesn't matter if you get bullseye. Not a lot of people do. In fact, somewhere around a third or less of people actually give birth on their due date. Most of us give birth on either side of it. And there is a thought that the average due date is actually closer to about 41 weeks and 3 days. So we can talk about that in a minute. But so we've got your due date as 40, and then we can count back for 3 weeks and count forward for 5, okay? So somewhere in that window. Before 37 weeks is, we call that preterm. We don't necessarily call that, well, it is premature technically, but we don't often call those babies premature, and we definitely don't call them preemies, because most babies born in 35 and 36 weeks need very little extra help to get them going and keep them nice and healthy in those first days and weeks after birth. Whereas if we keep going backwards, if we step backwards to 32 weeks or 30 weeks, those are babies who are definitely, when they're born at that time, they're definitely going to need some help. We're going to have to make sure that they're breathing well. We're going to have to make sure that their vision is good, that their lungs are okay, that they're able to eat food. And so often babies that tiny, they might not be able to breastfeed right away. So we may need to feed them with a little tube in a similar fashion to the way they eat through the umbilical cord. But this time we're just going to have a nasogastric tube, or we're going to do something called gavage feed, where we sort of put a little tube into their mouth and we feed them with a tube that way, gravity feed them, instead of having a permanent tube placed, or have a permanent tube placed and feed them periodically. So that's usually what we do for smaller preemies, actual preemies. But right around 36, 37, just before 37 weeks, we call that preterm. So there's late preterm, which is about 36 weeks in that week. There's preterm, or mid preterm, and early preterm. And the degree of pretermness determines how likely it is that your baby will need a little extra help, right? And then definitely before early preterm is premature, and those babies are definitely going to need assistance to a lesser or greater degree, depending on their particular circumstances. And then after you're due, so you have your due date at 40 weeks. And then after that, everything after that is known as post dates. And so it's really, really common for perfectly healthy parents who've had really nice, healthy pregnancies, who do not expect any bumps along the road, to give birth in the week or two after their due date. And so, yeah, we see numbers around 41 weeks and 3 days. That's what I mean. Is very common, but that's also a common time to be induced if you haven't yet had your baby. So, we see a lot of numbers, because when we look at all the babies born and all their health outcomes, we realize that the best time to start an induction if someone hasn't had their baby yet is 41 weeks and about 3 days. So if you have not had your baby by, say, 41 weeks, then you are likely going to have a very serious conversation about kickstarting that birth with an induction and planning it for 2 to 3 days in the future. And we can talk about inductions in a future episode, and what they're like, why they're done, how they're done. And but today we're just going to talk about the due dates in relation to the induction. You're just running up against a wall, essentially. So here in Hamilton, what the standard is if, as I explained, if you've gone to 41 weeks and you haven't had your baby, they will book an induction for you. And they'll usually book it by about 41 and 3. You may even have this conversation around your due date. So, by the time it's your due date, you're going to be visiting with your midwife or your OB or your family practitioner doctor every week. So you go in every single week and talk to them. Or you may actually, in these days, you may just have a phone visit for one of those visits. But right near the end, you're going to be connecting with your care provider very often. So if you give birth around 40, or if it is 40 weeks and you're going to see your doctor, maybe it's 40 weeks and 2 days. That's the day your appointment's on. And your doctor looks at you and thinks, you're not going to have a baby in the next day or so, maybe. So if you don't, why don't we go ahead and next week we'll book you? And a lot of times the doctors in the Hamilton system, because they work on an on-call rotation, they'll often see if they can book you in on a day when they're in the hospital providing care. So that a lot of parents really like that, because it means that the person they've been working with for the last, 6+ months for prenatal care, that's the person who's going to be potentially, welcoming their baby into the world. And that's really appealing to a lot of people. So a lot of doctors will attempt to get their patients in on a day when they will be in the hospital. And they can pre-book those things in advance. So they say, oh yeah, I'm in next Friday is my day at the hospital. So why don't we book you in for an induction? And so what they will do is they will have you, it's not a guarantee that you'll be induced on that day. And certainly if baby decides to come before that, that's awesome. Your doctor is going to be very, very happy about that, because they know that adding extra medicine and extra stuff to your birth is going to potentially cause some problems. There's just statistically, there's more chances of needing more things or baby needing a little extra help afterwards. And they don't want to do that if possible. So they're going to always root for the path of less intervention. At least that's true here in Hamilton. I don't know any doctors who are gleeful to give their clients more medicine at the end of pregnancy if it can be helped. they're always looking to help you safely deliver your baby. So we've talked about premature, preterm, term, and then post dates. And post dates, again, is part of term, but it is the days after your due date. And then overdue, technically, if you're overdue, we're really meaning after 42 weeks. And it's incredibly rare for people to go past 42 weeks. The only clients that we have had in the past who've gone past 42 weeks, or anyone in the community that I've heard about who has gone past 42 weeks, that's generally a situation where they are very strongly advocating for themselves, that they have a lot of extra sort of monitoring in the days in the end of their pregnancy. They're checking their vitals, making sure they don't have fevers, making sure that the baby is nice and healthy every single day, just because of the way the stats work out in making births that are happening after 42 weeks a little more difficult, a little more filled with complications, right? That's why we don't want people to go past 42 weeks generally as a community protocol, because just the numbers are not great on the mom and baby side of things. So we want to just sort of help things along, right? And that's all dependent on those due dates. So we go back now to, what the due date you thought you had, what you originally got, and then you got an ultrasound and you had your date changed. So now that those changes start to become really important, because if your baby's due date is a little farther down, right? So remember I said I have a due date that I think should be April 30th, but then my midwife sends me for an ultrasound, and the ultrasound says, no, your due date should be more like May 3rd. So now, if I'm having my baby, if I get, if it's 36 and 6, right, which is when I had my baby, let's use that as an example because I've got that easy in my head. So if I have my baby, if I go into labor at 36 and 6, if I was following my original due date, then I would be term. I wouldn't be preterm. But if I'm following the ultrasound measurement due date, then I am slightly preterm. And so we're going to make sure that I'm having my baby in the hospital. I can't have a home birth if I'm preterm, only if I'm term, and certainly only up to 41 weeks and 6 days. So you get from 37 and 0 to 41 and 6 for a term home birth. And any dates, any labors that happen outside of those dates are going to be happening in a hospital, just because we want to make sure that we're taking every single precaution possible to make sure mom, birthing person, and baby are nice and safe and healthy. So it's not to my advantage to have that ultrasound date in that preterm scenario. But if I was one of the very, very many birthing people who go over that due date, who are post dates, and if I'm thinking I really, really, really want to have a home birth, but now I'm 41 weeks and 5 days, if I was following my original due date, then I would already be overdue. Or I'd already be like past my window to be able to have a home birth. If I'm following the ultrasound date, then I'm within the window. Yay! So that's why those like dates, even if they shift by a couple of days, why it's really important that we keep those in mind. Because it's not, we don't want to mess around with babies, right? Like it's really important for us as birthing people to exercise as much control as we can over the process as far as it serves us and our personal needs. You know, like if I want to have a home birth, I want to have a home birth and I should have that option. But at the same time, it's super important that we also keep in mind what the general safety realities are in those scenarios, and, you know, make sure that we're keeping those babies as safe as possible. So, yeah, it's kind of complicated, right? It's really complicated, but due dates are, and it doesn't necessarily mean a lot to us. I can't actually remember what my original due dates are for my first baby. I can't even remember for my second baby. I don't know if, I think for my second baby, because it was a surprise pregnancy. I wasn't planning and I wasn't really tracking very well. So I wasn't really sure exactly how far along I was. So that didn't get confirmed until later in the process. And that baby came 30, I think that baby came within 37 weeks, like towards the end. So really more like 2 weeks early. My first baby, though, I'm pretty sure that I thought my due date was the 30th of April. No, maybe a little in the 20 somethings of April. And then it got pushed. And then the baby came 3 weeks early, which landed me just on one day into preterm territory. So I was one day away from being term. And then as a result, the baby was born in the hospital, which is great. We need a little extra help anyway after he was born because he had jaundice. So I was in the right place instead of being at home and then having to go back into hospital with the baby and have the baby admitted as a patient. That's not fun. That happened with my second birth and I hated it. So, yeah, that's what I went through. What did you go through? What did your dates change to? Do you remember what the original due date was and what your new due date became? And then when was your baby born? These 3 different dates are very kind of fascinating. I wonder if there's some sort of kind of like birth astronomy where we take those different dates and the differences as they change mean something. That sounds like fun, but it also doesn't really sound like science, does it? And we try really hard to look at the evidence and examine what the scientific evidence and the actual practical evidence around us is when we're making these choices and changes and determining how to take care of you lovely, lovely people. So, if you were a little confused about due dates and what that all meant and why 40, well, honestly, 40 is a nice round number, isn't it? That's why we use that number specifically, because we can't say you're due between this month and that month, somewhere in there. That's not a sexy time. It's not an easily transcribed data point as a 40-week due date is. And we call those due dates, by the way, EDDs, estimated due date. So remember, your due date is not an order form. It's not your delivery confirmation day. It is the approximate day that your baby will be born, but it's likely you have more chance that your baby will come either before or after than directly on your due date. So I'd love to hear from you guys. Please tell us when your due dates and your delivery days were, your birthdays, and we'd love to celebrate those with you. And if you're still pregnant, tell us, have you had a dating ultrasound? Did they shift your date? And how do you feel about that? Because that can bring up some feelings. I'm looking forward to seeing those comments. I hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you again for joining us. And next week, come back because we're going to be talking about C-sections and how to process if you have an unexpected C-section. And that's our lead up show to the following show when we're going to be talking about C-section scars with Mississauga Myofascial Mississauga. We'll be talking about scars and what you need to know about a C-section scar. Okay, so I'm Leanne Palmerston from Hamilton Family Doulas. You are watching or listening to Birth and Baby Talk, and we appreciate you. Have a wonderful day.